Dr. Mike, a very good morning to you. I suppose once again we expected that this would be the case, but it's always a bit worrying when you find out that it's really happening.
Yes, indeed. There's always been a gap between what governments say in public and what they do behind closed doors. There's a gap between the policies they promise and the policies they deliver. And this is a classical example of it. Politicians from both political parties have talked tough on asylum, but what we find time and time again is a debasement of rules and guidelines. And, you know, this empowers unscrupulous people such as rogue solicitors and obviously the people traffickers themselves. It's shocking, but not surprising.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to bring the lawyers into it, because clearly, you know, there are two sort of groups of people who are going to benefit hugely from this kind of policy. One, the migrants, traffickers themselves, who will say to them, here's what you do. You get to England, you just get your feet on the ground. They'll take you to some, you know, centre where they'll ask you a few questions. Just either say this or just say nothing, or just tell them a load of lies and you'll be fine. Similarly, these lefty lawyers, many of them we know are pressuring, shall we say, migrants to come up with different narratives, and we've already seen law offices closed down as a result, will say, just tell them this and you'll be fine. I mean, it makes a mockery, doesn't it, of our sort of national security?
It makes a mockery. Suella Braverman, a few months back, said the system was rigged against the British people and the British taxpayer. And that's correct. But the Conservatives have been in power for well over a decade. And it begs the question, who oversaw these guidelines? Was servants given a steer? Who signed it off? Those are questions that need to be asked, and we need answers.
Yes. And apparently there are some ministers now who are saying the government needs to change this. They need to stop this nonsense. And, you know, to have a guide that says, don't ask people questions that they might find upsetting, and even if they lie to you, don't dismiss their application. I mean, is it any wonder that these application processes are taking so long? Although it would seem to me that if they might as well not bother asking them any questions, might as well just process them straight away. My big problem still with this processing argument is that it's all very well for people to say, well, they need to process the claims quicker, but what if they process the claims and then find that they're not eligible? We still can't send them anywhere.
Yeah, in the mid-noughties, the rejection rates for asylum applications was close to 90%. But today the acceptance rate is slightly above 70%.
Yeah.
So clearly there's been a debasement of standards over time. And, you know, historically, immigration officers had enormous power. These were serious people. They were entrusted with interviewing these people, looking at the applications. They'd have a senior officer who would give a second pair of eyes over this. But ultimately, if you came into the UK with fraudulent or dodgy documents, they would deport you.
Yeah.
And this would be done very quickly.
Well, quite. Well, this is my other problem with those who argue that the French processing system or the French processing centre is the way forward. Because, again, if you process people in France and you find that they haven't qualified to come to Britain, then what do you think they're going to do? You think they're just going to wander off home? No, they're going to come on a dinghy.
Precisely. When the British people voted for Brexit in 2016, the government needed to think very seriously about, you know, new bilateral arrangements and how it would deal with the deportation process, but it didn't do so. I mean, morally, the correct thing to do is to take these people back to France, but politically, for the French, that's not going to happen because they don't want these people in their country. So the government has made a rod for its own back. But again, this is just emblematic of the incompetence and short-termism of the government.
Yeah. And meanwhile, you know, the boats keep coming. The Bibi Stockholm has kind of disappeared off the radar. Nobody's talking about it anymore. I assume that they've got the 50 people who were on it originally back on it again. But what about the other 450 people that are supposed to be on it? Is anything happening there as far as you know?
I'm not sure, but at the end of the day, the Bibi Stockholm is a publicity stunt. Yeah. It's a sort of, the government is using it as a visual statement that it's got control of the situation. But, last month you'd need around 6 BB Stockholms to hold the illegal immigrants who came into this country.
Yeah.
And there have been delays with RAF Scampton. So, it's a drop in the ocean in terms of dealing with this problem.
Yeah. And more hotels still being commandeered, despite Rishi Sunak's promise to no longer put many more hotels on the list. One hotel last week that we mentioned, that we brought up, Harben House Hotel, it was another Richard Tice story, a convicted criminal who has been committed for actually defrauding people over housing, has been given funding to house migrants in this hotel, which seems to beg a belief, one, on the basis that, he's actually now having an opportunity to make more money from something that he's already committed crime in the sector. And it seems as though they're not vetting the people that are running these hotels.
Yeah, I mean, it says in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And there's nothing new about rogue landlordism. I mean, in the 1950s, we had the infamous slum landlord, Peter Rackman, who owned a lot of property in Notting Hill.
Yeah.
He'd subdivide this property into, mouldy shoeboxes, and he'd pocket huge sums of cash off the booming Commonwealth immigration.
Yes.
And we're seeing exactly the same thing today. Essentially, the Treasury is there to maintain law and order, but they're paying large sums of cash to convicted felons, to rogue landlords. And it really does stick to the craw, because, the British taxpayer has to fund this. And we're going through a cost of living crisis. There's a crisis in the housing market, and we're paying, half our income to live in very small properties. Many people can't get onto the property ladder. Yeah. Those that are on the property ladder are paying huge interest rates. It's scandalous. It really is.
Yeah. It really is, and they don't seem to have, as you say, any clue about how to fix it. Mike Jones, thanks very much indeed.